Have you ever paused to wonder how thin the membrane really is between the person you think you are and the creature you could become? Most of us live with the comforting illusion that evil is a category reserved for others: dictators, serial killers, fanatics, war criminals. We like to think of ourselves as standing firmly on the side of decency, perhaps flawed, but fundamentally good. Yet psychology, history, and neuroscience suggest something far more disturbing. The monster you fear most might be quietly dormant inside you, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. This isn't melodrama. It's science, and it's terrifying. We like to imagine our moral identity as something fixed, like a granite statue, solid, permanent, unmistakably ours. When we hear about atrocities, our reflex is to reassure ourselves, I would never do that. But psychology, neuroscience, and history all point in a far darker direction. The self is not carved in marble. It is traced in sand, easily reshaped by the tide of circumstance, by uniforms and roles, by fear, fatigue, and the silent weight of other people's expectations. Philip Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect makes this porous boundary impossible to ignore. In the Stanford prison experiment, a group of healthy, ordinary college students, carefully screened to be sound, slipped into cruelty within days. They weren't sadists hiding in plain sight. They became cruel because the situation invited it. A uniform, a baton, anonymity, the tacit permission to dominate. These were enough to transform ordinary boys into something unrecognizable. The lesson is chilling. Monsters don't walk among us. Ordinary people become monstrous when the environment is engineered to bring it out of them. The comforting claim, I would never, begins to crumble once you look at the evidence. Children who cheat in one setting may not cheat in another. Adults, when placed in a group that unanimously voices "Ali," will often deny the evidence of their own eyes and conform. In Stanley Milgram's experiment, 65% of participants delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks because a man in a white coat told them to continue. And seminarians, on their way to give a lecture about the Good Samaritan, walked past a man slumped in distress far more often if they were running late. Morality isn't a stable signature trait. It bends under time pressure, authority, crowd behavior, and stress. The you who is calm, rested, and supported is not the same you who is exhausted at 2 a.m., ordered by a superior, and told that others are depending on you. Even the way we dress alters the boundaries of empathy. A lab coat sharpens focus, mirrored sunglasses hide the eyes and mute compassion. A uniform and a title offer both license and mask. This is what someone like me does, and if it feels wrong, well, it wasn't really me, it was the job. The BBC prison study, conducted decades after Stanford with more oversight, showed something similar. People don't need to be predisposed to cruelty. They only need a framework that legitimizes it. Neuroscience adds another disturbing layer. Moral judgment isn't dictated by a single guardian inside the brain. It's a coalition of systems. The prefrontal cortex weighs long-term outcomes and social norms. The amygdala floods us with fear or rage, narrowing our vision to us versus them. Reward circuits glow when our group approves, even when what we're doing is harmful. Stress, sleep loss, heat, crowding, these states weaken deliberation and strengthen impulses to conform or aggress. Change the state, and you change the verdict. The slide from decent to damaging rarely happens in one leap. It begins with small steps, agreeing to a minor violation that makes the next one easier, or doing something good and then feeling licensed to bend a rule later. Euphemisms blunt conscience. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. Civilians become collateral damage. Responsibility is diffused across committees, so guilt is shared and halved. And when people are labeled as animals or vermin, empathy doesn't just fade, it collapses. At that point, cruelty can feel like procedure. Picture a man who spends his evening building block towers with his daughter. In another setting, in another uniform, that same man might sign an order consigning strangers to misery. That dissonance is not hypocrisy. It is plasticity. He is not two people, but one nervous system responding to two contexts. The real question is not, who am I? But where am I, with whom, under what pressures, and what happens if I refuse? Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s remain one of the most unsettling windows into human nature. Participants, instructed by a man in a white lab coat, administered what they believed were lethal shocks to innocent strangers. 65% went all the way to 450 volts, even as victims screamed in pain. These were not psychopaths. They were accountants, teachers, clerks, good people. Why did they do it? Because an authority told them to. The neurological basis is clear. Brain scans reveal that obedience to authority reduces activity in areas associated with moral reasoning, shifting responsibility away from the self. In other words, when told, "I'll take responsibility," many of us surrender our conscience. The Holocaust wasn't perpetrated by a few demons. It was executed by thousands of ordinary citizens, many of whom later said, "I was just following orders." That sentence alone should send a chill down your spine. Have you ever caught yourself typing something online that you would never dare say face to face? Maybe it was sharper, harsher, or crueler than you'd like to admit. That small shift is not trivial. It's a glimpse into a phenomenon psychologists call de-individuation. When identity dissolves, responsibility vanishes. Behind the shield of anonymity, morality loosens, and the person who normally weighs words carefully feels emboldened to unleash venom. Philip Zimbardo illustrated this dynamic in a strikingly simple way. He and his team abandoned a car in two different places. In the Bronx, where anonymity and urban chaos provided cover, the car was vandalized and stripped within hours. In Palo Alto, a smaller and more close-knit community, the exact same car sat untouched for a week. The lesson was unmistakable. Visibility protects morality. Invisibility frees the impulse toward destruction. What people fear most is not punishment, but being seen. That's why masks, uniforms, even something as small as mirrored sunglasses matter so much. They erode empathy by breaking the face-to-face bond that keeps us accountable to each other. A soldier behind a visor, a policeman in riot gear, or a protester in a balaclava becomes less an individual and more a role, a function, a shadow. The human vanishes into the crowd, and when the individual disappears, so too does the sense of responsibility. This is why mobs burn cities, why armies commit atrocities, and why cyberbullies thrive. Hidden, the human becomes less human, both to others and to himself. If de-individuation is one cloak of moral erosion, language is another. Words are not neutral, they shape reality. The most insidious evils rarely announce themselves as such. They creep in under the cover of euphemism. Torture becomes enhanced interrogation. The killing of civilians by drones is softened into collateral damage. Massacres are washed clean as ethnic cleansing. These are not just labels, they are weapons. Language is the scalpel that carves morality into silence. Albert Bandura, a giant in psychology, showed that euphemistic language detaches people from the moral weight of their actions. If you call a group of people animals, you can justify caging them. Call them vermin, and extermination begins to sound like hygiene rather than horror. The Nazis perfected this linguistic alchemy, turning genocide into bureaucracy. But they were not alone. Colonial empires spoke of civilizing missions while plundering and enslaving. Apartheid was defended with phrases like separate development. Even today, governments around the world hide brutality behind sterile jargon. Words deform perception, and perception erases conscience. What makes these processes so effective is that morality itself is fragile, because it is not fixed in some divine order. It is rooted in biology. Neuroscience confirms what philosophers have long suspected. The brain is not a fortress of ethics, but a battlefield where competing circuits fight for dominance. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for empathy and long-term reasoning, can be hijacked by stress, by authority, or by the pressure of the group. When adrenaline floods the system, the amygdala takes over, drowning out deliberation with raw impulses of fear and rage. In moments of crisis, the brain doesn't ask, "What is right?" It asks, "What will keep me and my group safe?" Cortisol levels spike, tunnel vision narrows the mind, and the nervous system defaults to primitive survival logic. Obey, conform, eliminate threats. In that state, the soldier who shoots into a crowd may not be weighing choices at all. He is obeying neural circuits older than civilization, ancient mechanisms that once kept tribes alive, but that, in the modern world, can turn compassion into cruelty in a heartbeat. Put together, these forces, anonymity, language, and biology, paint a grim but essential picture. Strip away visibility and people shed restraint. Wrap violence in euphemism and people fail to see it for what it is. Add stress and fear, and the brain itself conspires to collapse morality. The self we think of as stable and principled turns out to be terrifyingly fragile, more conditional than we'd like to admit. And yet knowing this is a form of armor. Awareness is the first defense. To understand how anonymity loosens conscience, how words anesthetize cruelty, and how stress hijacks the brain, is to place a hand back on the wheel of one's own humanity. Because if evil can creep in through hidden doors, vigilance is the act of keeping those doors locked. Consider Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat of the Holocaust. He wasn't a frothing madman. He was a desk worker, efficient and polite, who organized trains to Auschwitz with the detachment of a travel agent. Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, the terrifying normality of atrocity. Or Ivan Chip Frederick, the US Army reservist who tortured prisoners at Abu Ghraib. He was once an all-American boy who loved baseball and pie. He didn't arrive in Iraq as a sadist. The environment, authority, and chaos sculpted him into one. And then Jim Jones, who convinced over 900 followers to drink cyanide in the Guyana jungle. His followers were not lunatics. They were teachers, nurses, parents. They trusted. They obeyed. They died. The uncomfortable truth is this: you are not immune. None of us are. It doesn't matter how kind, gentle, or principled you believe yourself to be. You can donate to charity, smile at strangers, and love your children with all your heart, and still, under the wrong circumstances, find yourself capable of cruelty. History is full of good neighbors who became informants, loving fathers who became executioners, ordinary clerks who processed the machinery of genocide. The line between the hero and the monster does not run between good people and bad people. It runs through each of us. What separates the hero from the monster is not the absence of darkness, but the awareness of it. Carl Jung captured it with brutal clarity. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. To know your own shadow is to be less vulnerable to it. The person who insists, "I would never," is often the one who succumbs most easily when tested, precisely because they never prepared for the possibility. Believing yourself incorruptible makes you fragile. True resilience begins with admitting you are not. But here is the twist. The same psychological mechanisms that drag people into evil can also elevate them into heroism. The same malleability that makes us capable of harm also makes us capable of transcendent courage. Context bends character, yes, but context can bend it toward greatness as much as it can toward horror. Consider Wesley Autry, the New Yorker who became known as the subway hero. One day, as a train approached, he saw a man collapse onto the tracks during a seizure. Autry didn't wait for orders, and he didn't calculate his odds of survival. He didn't search for a cover story to justify his choice. He leapt down, pressed the man into the trench between the rails, and used his own body as a shield while the train thundered over them both. What makes this so powerful is not superhuman ability, but the fact that Autry was ordinary. He was a construction worker, a father walking with his daughters, an everyman who simply decided to act. That decision is the essence of heroism. It isn't about having nerves of steel or flawless virtue. It is about being willing in a moment when everyone else is frozen by fear or hesitation to step forward. Social psychology teaches us about the bystander effect. The more people who witness an emergency, the less likely it is that any one person will help. Each assumes someone else will take responsibility. Heroism is, at its core, the refusal to let responsibility diffuse. It is the decision to say, "If no one moves, I will." Zimbardo himself emphasizes this in his later work. Just as ordinary people can be swept into evil by circumstances, ordinary people can also be lifted into acts of extraordinary courage. The same brain that succumbs to obedience can also defy it. The same social pressure that silences can also inspire solidarity. What matters is whether we cultivate awareness, whether we practice questioning, whether we prepare ourselves to resist when the moment comes. And perhaps that is the most radical truth. You don't need a cape, wealth, or special training to be a hero. You don't need to be fearless. You need only to recognize that your choices matter, even when the situation pushes you toward passivity. Every small refusal to dehumanize, every moment of speaking up when silence would be easier, every act of courage in the mundane is practice for the extraordinary. The monster within us is real, but so is the hero. Which one steps forward depends less on fate than on awareness, preparation, and the courage to act when it is easier not to. Heroism is not the absence of darkness, it is the conscious decision in the presence of darkness to choose the light. Heroism, like evil, is situational. It requires vigilance, accountability, and the willingness to resist. The Milgram experiment had its rebels, those who defied authority, who refused to turn the dial. They weren't saints. They were ordinary people who, in that moment, refused to outsource their conscience. So why do good people become monsters? Because they forget they can. Because they surrender responsibility to uniforms, masks, or words. Because they trust authority more than their conscience. But there is another path. You can question authority, resist euphemism, refuse to dehumanize, and remain visible, accountable in your actions. The line between good and evil runs not between nations, not between us and them, but through every human heart. Your task is not to pretend the monster isn't there. Your task is to keep it on a leash. Every day you are asked, quietly, invisibly, to choose. To follow or to resist. To obey or to question. To close your eyes or to see. The difference between a hero and a monster is not fate. It is vigilance. And the next time you find yourself at that invisible cliff, that moral edge, remember, you are closer to it than you think.